our guests are Władimir Arieniew, Beukes, Stross, and Williams. It's great that you're all here. We're going to talk about the writers' careers, about the fandoms perhaps, about the obstacles that made our guests' lives harder, about things that have made your lives easier. And the first question is about this convention. How are you feeling at Pyrkon? And do you think there are some things that connected to other conventions in your country? Or maybe it's different from your experiences at conventions where you come from?
Start. Well, I'm probably going to say something that some of the others were also going to say, so I apologize for that. But I think probably all of us have been a bit surprised and impressed, first of all, by how large this convention is. Jazz was saying that he thought this might even be the biggest convention in Europe. I don't know about that, but I'm certainly impressed by the size and the enthusiasm. You know, it feels very much like one of the very big media conventions in the United States, like Comic-Con or something. Love to see the costuming, love to see the excitement, love to see the younger faces, which in our field is always a nice thing. So that's my take.
Yeah, Tack basically said everything I was going to say. Lots of diversity, lots of young people from all over Poland, I understand, which is good. Lots of media presence. This isn't the aging, greying SF fandom I'm very used to in the UK, but also a lot of younger geek fandom, gamers, computer folks, maker culture, costume, cosplay, a lot. And it's huge. I was not expecting anything this big. I thought there was a bit of a typo in the email I got saying that last time there were 13,000 people here. Surely they've added a 0 or 2.
I'm from South Africa and we don't have much of a fandom there. We've got a small convention which maybe gets about 3,000 people. And I went to the first one of those when I was 17 years old and, I don't know, a long time ago. And I went dressed as Chitara. I was in a leopard print swimming costume and big boots and kind of leopard print makeup. And that photograph is so buried, no one is ever going to find it. But there's such an amazing energy here and it's so great to see all the costumes. It does have kind of a San Diego Comic-Con feel. It's awesome to be here.
It's a really, really huge, big and fantastic con because in Ukraine, in Russia and in other Poland convents in which I was, the reason there are not so big, so white people, so it's good, it's really fantastic, I think. Sorry for my English.
It does seem that you're thinking the same thing. Maybe you'll disagree and start fighting later, we'll see. So, a question about your experiences in your countries, this time not about conventions, but about obstacles, about your struggles, your hardships. The question is, what have you had to struggle with, to fight against in your writers' careers? What has made your lives more difficult as writers?
One of most maybe strange thing is that in Ukraine there are not agents. So if you are writing a book, then you have to do some other things. You have to search an editor, a publisher, speak with them. All functions of agent, it's your problems. And you have to, sometimes you find artist for cover, for pictures in book, and all of these problems, from one side it's difficult because it's not yours. From other side, it's an interesting experience, and so it's one of problems with for a writer in Ukraine.
In South Africa, it was very hard to get science fiction or fantasy published, and it's changed a lot now. I think District 9 had a lot to do with that, because it just showed that there was a market for it. And when my book, Sioux City, won the Arthur C. Clarke Award, suddenly all the South African publishers were really interested in science fiction and fantasy. And then we've now got a really amazing scene which is kind of growing. But I think it's the same in Poland. If you're a writer, you can't really quit your day job. You have to have a normal job to pay the rent, to pay the bills, because your books just aren't going to do it. There are a couple of writers, me and Sarah Lotz, who are in South Africa. We've managed to get a big international deal, which means that we can write full time, but it's definitely not normal. It's very difficult. Most writers really struggle.
Yeah, Great Britain has, which is where I'm from, I live in Scotland, has several advantages. Most writers tend to be in their 30s to 40s by the time they become really successful. So the fact that we have a free national healthcare system is very important. I know a lot of Americans who would love to write full-time but can't. They have to have a day job just for health insurance. I've got the luxury of free healthcare. I've also got the advantage of writing and speaking in English, which gives me much easier access to the US market, which is the biggest. However, it is not really possible to earn a living as a full-time writer in the UK alone, unless you really enjoy living on lentils. So my biggest stroke of luck actually was getting a literary agent who's in New York, and I'm sold to the UK as an American imported author. I sound very American, don't I?
For me, I think the most difficult and important thing for a writer has to do with these two things. This and this. And keeping this attached to this. Simply to sit down day after day when you don't want to, when the ideas aren't coming, when it feels like a job, even though it is the best job in the world. Simply to sit down and do the work is the most important and most difficult thing for me, because, as any of these writers can tell you, the world is full of things more interesting than writing when you have to write. I get the most powerful urge all of a sudden to go to my sock drawer and put together all my socks into nice little bundles. Or suddenly I realize I haven't walked the dogs in years.
Yeah, but there's a mailing list for writers I'm on, and we have a term for what writers do when they should be writing but aren't. Why aren't you writing right now? Oh, I can't write at present. I've got to hoover the cat.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also one of the reasons why sometimes we do a little more research than we really need to. Because research is what we all grew up doing. It's called reading. And we like to read. Reading is fun. So, again, those of you who want to be writers out there, very simple first step. This, right here, attached to this, right here, every day for as long as possible.
sum it all up, socks and your drawers are the worst opponent of a writer. Get rid of socks if you want to write, and get a nice chair.
We're having a little bit of trouble, but I am anyway, having a little bit of trouble hearing you. If somebody can turn one of the monitors toward us a little more, maybe?
Let's do it this way. If anybody from the organizers is listening, and they can do anything to turn down the music and to let us...
Stop the music. Actually, just hold the microphone close, and then we get it through the monitor better.
Okay, so you're getting it now. Great, thank you. I'll keep to that. But I won't be talking much, I hope, so it shouldn't be important. You mentioned reading a lot, Dad. Have the rest of you had similar experiences that reading too much is what you got into and didn't get out of?
We used to go on long car trips in South Africa, and my mom would get so angry with me because I was never looking at the scenery, I was just reading the book, that she used to threaten to tie my eyelashes together so I couldn't read. I don't know how that would have helped me see the view, but reading is in the blood. And I know I have read some writer friends who say that they can't read while they're writing, but I have to read while I'm writing. I have to see how other writers deal with the similar problems, how they create the most beautiful evocative sentences, how they do amazing action scenes or dialogue, things that I didn't think of, and I find that very inspiring.
I am actually one of those writers who can't read while he's writing. However, I'm not writing all the time, and what usually happens is I'm writing, I'm getting very annoyed by being unable to relax by reading. I finish a manuscript and then I binge on 12 novels in a week.
Actually reading is one of part of working, my working. Sometimes I work as an editor of translations, and reading these translations, reading original texts, it's like some lessons, because when you read a good author, you are learning some special things, how he built a plot, how he do info dumps, for example, and so on. And it's very, I think, for me, it's very difficult lessons for me, like a writer.
Actually, I am one of those people who does get up every day and say, I have the most wonderful job in the world. Okay, I sincerely feel that way. However, the one thing that I am not happy about being a writer of fiction is it has cut drastically into the amount of fiction that I get to read. And there are a few reasons for that, but the most important is, when I was growing up, maybe 60 or 70% or more of what I read was novels, fiction, made up things. Now, 70 or 80% of what I read is nonfiction. It is research material, it is history, science, things like that. Also, because I am writing fantasy and science fiction every day, for me, oftentimes, when I am finished and doing what Jas talked about, which is to read a bunch of novels all at once, I don't want to read fantasy or science fiction. I want to read other kinds of books, which I also think is good for writers, too, to not read what they're writing, but read other kinds of fiction as well. So my only complaint about being a writer is it has cut drastically into my chance to read other people's novels. So.
All right, so we know what makes your lives harder, reading being one of these things sometimes. And what makes your lives easier? Some anecdotes, some experiences that you've had, helpful people, helpful fans, helpful markets. things that have helped you in developing your careers.
Okay, one of the things that has really improved my writing is the fact that my children are now teenagers, so they are not throwing up or filling diapers every 5 or 10 minutes. I don't know how some of the great female writers of history managed to write with small children vomiting and screaming around them, but I find it very difficult. So that's one thing. My children are now teenagers, and they never talk to me at all. This makes it much easier to be a writer. But I think the thing that I particularly find that helps me as a writer in our field, as a writer of science fiction and fantasy, is that we are so connected to our readers because of things like conventions. Because being a writer is a very, very solitary thing. It has to be. You have to go away from everybody and everything and take things out of your head and make something out of them. So most of the time you're on your own. It's easy to forget that real people are reading the things that you write. But in our field, the writers, the readers, the editors, the artists, we all spend time together. Many of our writers were people who went to conventions just as fans and then became writers themselves. There is a very tight connection in science fiction and fantasy between the writers and the people they're writing for. And I find that to be the most fulfilling thing for me, that when I'm having a bad day, now it's not my kids who vomit on everything, we have dogs and cats. So, I'm having a bad day and the cat is going over here and the dogs are howling upstairs because they can't get to me, And I can remember that there really are people out there who care what I'm doing and want to see me finish it. And that is an immense help at a very difficult time. So, thank you all for that.
Yeah. Tad basically said everything I was going to say, minus the kids, because I don't have kids. I do currently have a 15-month-old cat who gets bored with the way I'm peering at this strange glowing panel periodically, jumps on the desk, drops a toy on my keyboard, and won't leave until I've played fetch for 2 hours. That really doesn't help me write. On a more practical level, though, Tad and I are of an age where I think we both got started using manual typewriters. Yep. There is no hell like trying to rewrite a novel using a manual typewriter.
Computers, yeah!
Especially when the keys begin snapping from metal fatigue. Yeah, computers are wonderful. Computers are really, truly wonderful. And now we have the internet, which gives us new and entertaining ways to cat vacuum online for hours on end. Because it is really a solitary occupation. You don't have many other jobs where you go into an office and work on your own for 8 hours a day. One of the other things is the ability to actually get in touch with readers directly. And, I have a group of test readers who read stuff as I write it and point out all the embarrassing typos and continuity errors. Given that I have a memory like a sieve, this is really, really useful.
For me, the best thing and the worst thing in my life is Twitter, because I can spend many, many hours on Twitter, and it almost counts as work because I'm interacting with my fans. But Twitter is also amazing because it allows me access to places in the world that I couldn't get otherwise. And there are some questions which you cannot Google, like, what is the best place to dump a body in Johannesburg? I think the NSA probably has a file on me. So I asked my Twitter followers, what's the best place to dump a body in Johannesburg? And they came back unanimously with a little part of Johannesburg called Troyville. So I wrote that down and then I blocked all those scary people who knew about dumping bodies. So I also use Twitter for my research. I'll go to Chicago and I'll say, hey, I really need to talk to a Chicago police detective, or I really need to hang out with some teenagers in Detroit. can anyone hook me up? And people do, and people are engaged and interested, and they want to help, and they want you to write their stories, and that's amazing and very humbling to me, that people want to help and they get involved and they're so into the book. It's really amazing.
For me, maybe most difficult bits is travels, because when you travel, you change a social role which you play when you're in homeland, when you're in social, with your friend, maybe with your. So when you come in con, for example, you are change some social role. You can be just maybe a nerd sometimes, and it's good. It's and understanding that what you do is interesting for people. That it's difficult maybe for people, and it's give you a power for do it better and more.
All right, so let's imagine a thing. All difficulties considered, all helpful things considered, the current situation on markets considered. Let's say that you're all, again, young aspiring writers to be, and you're wondering whether to go into the writing career or not. The year is 2014, it's now, and you have to decide whether to go into writing or not. And would you do that now? If you were to start now, would you do this?
Yes.
You know, I don't think writing is so much a calling as it is a disease. It's a terrible, terrible compulsion, and I find writing very difficult, and I find it very lonely, and it generally makes me unhappy, but the only thing which makes me more unhappy than writing is not writing.
Yeah, I think if you scratch any writer, you find a couple of psychiatric maladies. The first of them, writers are generally introverts. They think about the inside of their own head a lot, and while they can be the life and soul of a party for a while, there are some introverts who can pretend to be an extrovert for a few days, but they then have to go and hide in a small room and talk to a screen. The other thing you will find is obsessive-compulsive disorder. There's no other explanation for why I wrote about 15 or 20 novel-shaped things from the age of 12 onwards until I was in my mid-30s and was actually writing something that you could call a novel that publishers could buy. That's not a sane thing to do. And that, I think, is where a lot of writers come from. It's not so much a would you want to start it if you knew how hard it would be, it's how could you not? And, you know, the other alternative is to start gobbling pills.
The only thing I can say is there are times when I look at what I do for a living, which is to write stories and get them published in books, and I feel like one of the really good makers of chariot wheels, you know? There is that feeling, right? That am I doing something that is a dying art? I think that with me, for instance, I know that no matter what, I would be telling stories for all the reasons that Vlad and Lauren and Chaz mentioned, that I would have to tell stories. It is a compulsion. I do it whether they come out of my head or not. They're always going on in my head all the time. They may be in the background if I'm pretending to pay attention to something other than writing, but they're still there. So I would be telling stories no matter what. But if I was 18 years old now and given the choice of how are you going to tell stories, I might pick another way to do it. I might want to do, you know, something that was a little closer to the zeitgeist of the future. But I can't swear because books and text formed me. putting books and putting words into books is actually, although it may be less popular in years ahead, there are ways in which it is still the summit of art, I think. And the reason is because of all the kinds of ways of telling stories, words are the most dense way of transmitting information, and they inspire the most interaction from the person reading them. If you go to a movie, it may be a brilliant movie, but you're basically on a roller coaster amusement park thrill ride where you are strapped into a seat and you are seeing only what the director lets you see. When one of us writes a story and we describe, let's take a cliche, a tall tower dimly seen through the mist as you approach it up an abandoned road with trees growing closely on either side, well, the reader is making that far more personal to themselves than I ever could if I filmed it or if I made an RPG out of it or anything like that. So there are times I wonder about the exact choice of how I make stories, but I think given the choices, I still will go back to being a writer of books as being the thing that best suits what I want to do and what I like most in the world.
So the writing disease is strong in you. The writing force is strong in you, yeah. Okay, I think it would be great. We have 20 more minutes now. It might be great if we gave you a chance to ask questions to our guests. It's not very easy with this black and yellow fence, but I have a weapon in my hand, I'm not afraid to use it. So let's try.
Well, hello. Well, I have to make my question quite long to express myself fully. Mozart was once said to answer a question, Maestro, how to write a symphony, to start with something simpler. But Maestro, you started writing symphonies when you were just 5. Yes, but I never asked how to write one. And have you ever asked questions just like I am right now asking how to write or how to begin, or was it just so natural for you, or did you have I don't know, some idol, someone you wanted to be like and just end up being who you are now?
It's difficult ways for difficult texts. Every time when you started some texts, it's going like maybe detective work. Sometimes you know about something about world, and then you have find a hero for this story. Sometimes you have a hero, you don't know about world no, not anything, but a lot of things. So you, as a detective, you have to do some work, some research, some fictional research, not in other books, non-fictional books, but in your imagination. And build this world, and build these heroes, and build this story, and then you start. When you didn't, if you didn't do this, sometimes it may be good story, sometimes it may be bad story, because it's my opinion. You have to do this research, this fictional research, imaginary research.
I think you have to get over your fear of failure. You have to just write no matter what, and you you screw up along the way and you learn from that. I think you're going to have a day job if you want to be a writer. So if you can get a day job which feeds into your writing somehow. I was a journalist for a long time, and that taught me storytelling. And sometimes I'd have to do very boring stories on best convention centers in South Africa. But I had to write it in such a way that I was interested to write it and people were interested to read it. And that taught me more. It's like the basketball players who practice with a smaller hoop. It's people who write symphonies who do piano scales. You have to learn the basics and stuff, but the most important thing is to try and fail and try again.
Yeah, Rogers and Lasny was once asked pretty much this question, and he said it's really easy, anybody can be a writer, you just have to write 1 million words of rubbish. And the point of 1 million words, and it is a fairly accurate measure, is you are learning by doing, and a lot of the time you will be failing, but each time you will fail better, you will fail for different reasons. I was a slow learner, it took me about 2 million words of rubbish. But I sort of got there in the end to the point of writing stuff that people evidently want to read. But it's like many skills, it takes a lot of practice. You don't become a concert pianist overnight, you don't become Tiger Woods with champion golfer overnight. There is one estimate I've seen, is that anybody can become really proficient at a given skill if they put in approximately 10,000 hours of work. I'd say for some skills it can be a bit lower, more like 5,000. This is equivalent to 3 years of doing it full time as a day job, or maybe 10, 20 years of doing it at hobbyist level. But you can get there in the end, it just takes a lot of application. And this is why I said earlier that most authors are obsessive compulsives, because only somebody who's obsessive compulsive about writing would bother to do this.
I would only change one recommendation, which is, as Charles said, you have to write a lot of rubbish to write well. But if you just stick to rubbish, you'll make more money. So, that's something to consider. No, I think that, first of all, what everybody is saying, all true. I think the main thing is, and where the obsessive-compulsive part comes in, is I don't think, I may be wrong, but I think most of us started writing before we had a plan of becoming writers, but it was more just, well, like, I want to do this. I want to do this. So that's the first thing, is you can outthink yourself. You can spend way too much time trying to get things right, or trying to wait until you're in the right situation. But as you're hearing, one of the most important things is making mistakes. You can never start making mistakes too soon. But here's one of the things that I see is crippling for a lot of new writers, is that they are so concerned with the fact that they've learned things since they started that they oftentimes will keep going back to the same idea, trying to make it better and trying to make it better. And what I've seen in many cases is people spend 5 years rewriting the same first 2 chapters of the same story, trying to get it perfect. No, you write all the way through it, make every mistake to be made, including the mistakes of not knowing how to write an ending, but at least trying, and then you throw that crap out, and you start again. But again, the main thing is, to be a writer, you must be driven to write. If you're not driven to write, if you're not driven to tell a story, forget it. There are many easier things to do and many more satisfying things to do with less amount of work. But if you are driven to write, then just keep at it. Learn by imitating. That's what we all do when we first start. We write things that are like other things we like. So make your influences as broad as possible. Then you will bring more into your own voice as it develops. If you want to write fantasy, for God's sakes, don't just read fantasy. Read as much other stuff as you can, and those choices will help you to create an individual voice as a writer.
I just want to say that I spent 4 years messing around on my first book, Moxieland, and I was doing it as my master's in creative writing at the University of Cape Town. And thank God, the dean of the university turned around to me and said, if you do not finish this book, we are kicking you out of the program. And you know what? I finished it in 3 months, no problem. As soon as I stopped messing around with those first 3 chapters, it was easy. But if it hadn't been for him, I would still be writing Moxieland. So the most important thing you can do is finish. And if it's a mess, that's okay. You can fix a mess. A mess is always better than a blank page.
Hello, I have 2 questions for you. First one is quite simple. Why sci-fi and fantasy? Why are you writing books for geeks? And the second question is writing sci-fi or fantasy easier or more difficult than writing more mainstream literature?
I write for geeks because I am a geek. But I also don't set out to write a specific genre. I just write the stories that I think are interesting, and then afterwards my publisher's like, oh, that's urban fantasy. And I'm like, okay. I think it might be harder to get taken seriously by, you know, the New York Times book review. But I think it's probably easier to get published, and it's amazing to have an audience that you can connect with, which I don't think a lot of other genres do. I think crime comes close, but not like this. Yeah.
Same situation. Sometimes I write fantasy, sometimes science fiction, sometimes horrors or mystic stories. It's question of idea. It's question of story that you have here and here. And other things, it's problems of editor and publisher.
Several reasons for why I write fantasy and science fiction. The first is that I grew up with that as my first love as a developing reader from about ages 10 to 13, when I really began to choose books instead of running into books that other people gave me or whatever. I found that that's what I loved. And for me, one of the very most important things that you can bring is love of what you're writing. I think that even bad writing works better if the author really believes and cares about what they're doing. And good writing is even more motivated by the deep love of the person doing it for the thing that they're writing about. So that's a huge thing for me as I write fantasy and science fiction, because I grew up loving fantasy and science fiction. The one other thing, which I've never heard other people talk about, and is very real to me, is that I like being able to make art within a sort of pre-existing structure. If you think about something like ballet, or certain other art forms, opera, okay? What the individual brings to them has to take place in a certain structure, in a certain framework. But if you satisfy that framework, then you can do it any way you want to. I'll make basically genre fiction, which is what we all write. Science fiction, fantasy, crime, mystery. Genre fiction is an agreement between the writer and the audience. I simplify it in my case by saying, as I can write as literary or as artistic a piece as I want, as long as every 10 pages something tries to eat my main character, right? As long as I keep the audience involved and satisfy them that they are getting more or less what they expect out of the genre, I can be as individual and as creative as I want. And I like that tension, if you know that word, that tension between the expectation of genre and the creativity of the individual writer.
Yeah, I've had time to think about it now. When we write fiction, we are telling stories, we're trying to externalize a stream of thought that examines something to do with the human condition. We're telling stories from inside a human being's head. And there's 2 directions you can point the imaginary camera in. One is at the contents of human heads, at human relationships, at human interactions, at human activities. And another is at the world around the human head. The traditional pattern of mainstream literary fiction for about the past 100 years in the English language has been towards tighter and tighter introspection and focus on character. And you know, this is important, but it's also very, very limiting because characters do not exist in a vacuum. We interact with the world around us. And I'm always looking out for new things around me and trying to keep my eyes open. And I just find it more interesting to come up with new ideas and see how these affect the characters who are wandering through the narrative. As for why do I write it, writing any book is a long-term project. While I've written some in a blinding hurry, basically being chained to the keyboard and driven to write compulsively in less than a month, the longest it's ever taken me to write a book was 5.5 years. And I'm talking about ones that were published. You should never commit to a work project of that kind of duration, where the average duration is measured in years, but you're not in love with, or at least very happy to spend years working on.
At first it's a great thrill to be able to hear from you. Great. And I'd like to know your thoughts about e-books and digital books and the struggle between paper book and e-books.
Fundamentally, this question is about as interesting as answering about the question about the life or death struggle between mass market paperbacks and hardbacks. At the end of the day, they're still books.
I think it's just a different medium. It's a different kind of syringe for your heroin.
E-books, it's a great form for reading, for giving information, giving books for people to can buy it in paper. So it's great.
I think it also makes books much more accessible, and especially coming in from a country in South Africa where books are very expensive. It costs 25 euros for a book, which is 2 days' salary for some people. And now the books are available on cell phones and even pirated books. These people are never going to buy books anyway, and if they're pirating books, at least they're getting some love of books and language, and maybe they'll grow up and be able to afford books and buy them later. So I think from accessibility, ebooks are amazing too.
Yeah, one thing I should mention, people have this idea that ebooks should be extremely cheap. In reality, most of the price of a paper book that you pay in a shop goes to distribution costs, goes to bookshops, it goes to warehouses. The actual physical cost of a paper is tiny. And again, the amount the publisher makes as profit is low, the amount the author makes as profit is low. A lot of it just goes to warehouses. Ebooks can potentially cut out the middlemen in distributing books to people, which means they will ultimately be more accessible and more widely available.
I'm going to do the one thing that the other panelists haven't done, which is I'm going to make a prediction, okay, based on historical precedent. Traditionally, every time a new technological paradigm of any kind comes along, I'll take an example of something most of you will remember because it happened, if not in your recent lifetime, at least in your lifetime. The synthesizer revolution in music, which happened in the 70s and 80s, okay? When people first invented computerized, digital, or other earlier forms of synthesized music where they could imitate real instruments, everybody said, well, why will anybody ever bother to use real instruments again when you can just do, you can just do it all on a keyboard and make it sound like a violin or whatever. 20 years later, you have an acoustic music rebirth. And everybody is learning how to play violins and dobros and a classical guitar. Because the very fact that something becomes common means there is a reaction. 20 or 30 years before that, when frozen food came into the mainstream, certainly in American life, everybody said, why will anybody ever cook with real food again? It's so much trouble when you can just take it out of the freezer and throw it in the oven, and 20 minutes later you have food. Well, you know, within 20 or 30 years after that, there's a boom in people making their own pasta from scratch, you know? Because the more something becomes simple and automated, the more people develop a nostalgia for the original thing. Now, how does this feed into ebooks and the ebook revolution? I predict that in the future what is going to happen, that on the one hand, yes, electronic books will, not now, but in another 20 years or so, will largely replace paperbacks. When the cost of losing your book on the train of an electronic book is no worse than losing your paperback book on a train. At that point, nobody cares what form it's in. However, when the electronic book becomes the most common mass market version of books available, the expensive, beautiful hardcover book will have a renaissance. And people will be treasuring and prizing and paying way too much money for beautiful books with beautiful binding and lovely illustrations and, who knows, maybe even three-dimensional textural work that you can't get on a computer. So, like people having a beautiful acoustic guitar when they can easily replicate it on a synthesizer, people who like books will have very beautiful books, but when they're going around town, when it's easy to keep 10,000 books on your pad or whatever, that's what they'll use. And the last thing on this is, when I realized that even though I am a paperback book or paper book person, that ebooks are going to come and they are going to change things. 2 years ago, my wife and I moved house. We moved from one house to another house. We had 4 gigantic trucks worth of our household belongings. 2.5 of those trucks were full of books. And I suddenly realized what the value of electronic books could be. Not carrying 50,000 goddamn books all the way across town in a truck. That's what. So.
I'm going to sort of agree, but have a bit of an argument with some of Tad's details. I had the same moving house experience 7 years ago, and I made a conscious decision, because I'm an early adopter techie type. I went almost 100% ebook 6 years ago, which was necessary because we have several thousand books in our apartment, and you can't build an extension off a 4th floor apartment. Now, what I'm going to disagree with Tad about is his prediction that ebooks will largely kill paperbacks in maybe 20 years' time. I'm going to stick my neck out and say 2 years' time. The reason, I was talking to an executive at one of the major publishing groups who deals with ebooks, and he had some very interesting figures for me. You may have noticed a lot of smartphones these days are getting bigger and bigger screens. You know, the 5-inch phablets. The Galaxy Note, phones like that. There's strong rumours Apple is going to produce one later this year. People are increasingly reading books on their phone. And the issue of losing your ebook reader on the train is becoming a non-issue because your ebook reader is simply whatever phone you have. At the same time, the manufacturer of the e-ink displays that go into Kindles and Nooks and other traditional ebook readers, they're actually shipping fewer and fewer panels because the mobile phones are eating them as a device. So I think what we're going to see is ebooks will primarily be read on big screen mobile phones, and this is going to happen much faster than anyone anticipates. I'm already told that in the United States, half of my book sales are ebooks, and this is only going to accelerate.
I just want to add that as far as piracy goes, please buy our books. You know, unless you're a kid in Soweto and you have no access to a library, that kid is allowed to pirate. You guys, you buying our books means that we can be here.